Most people know that chronic stress is bad for health. What most people do not know is how precisely it ages them. Every time cortisol remains elevated for hours rather than minutes, the pattern that defines modern working life, rather than the acute stress response the hormone was designed for, it initiates a cascade of cellular events that researchers have been able to measure directly. Oxidative stress increases. Reactive oxygen species accumulate. And the telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes that function as biological age markers, shorten faster than they should. A 2012 study published in PLOS ONE found that women in chronically high-stress environments showed telomere shortening equivalent to 10 additional years of biological aging compared to women in low-stress environments. Not 10%, 10 years. The researchers who have studied the populations with the longest documented health spans, Okinawa, Sardinia, Ikaria, Nicoya, Loma Linda, consistently identify low chronic stress as one of the shared variables across all 5 zones. Not diet alone, not genetics, not exercise. The absence of the sustained cortisol elevation that drives cellular aging in the surrounding populations was a consistent finding in every blue zone studied. What is remarkable is how that absence was achieved. Not through meditation apps, not through breathwork protocols or stress management courses, through 5 specific cultural rituals built into the structure of daily life so completely that chronic stress accumulation became architecturally difficult. Today, I'm going to show you all 5. And at the end, I will tell you something about what the Okinawa Centenarian data found about oxidative stress markers in 100-year-olds that changed how the researchers understood the relationship between lifestyle and cellular aging. Stay until the end, because the oxidative stress piece connects everything. Ritual 1, the Sardinian happy hour. Every evening in the mountain villages of Ogliastra, before dinner, the men gather. Not at a bar, at each other's houses, on terraces, outside the village store. They drink a small glass of canonau wine. They talk, they laugh. They argue about nothing important. They have been doing this for as long as anyone can remember. This is not incidental. It is structural. The gathering happens every evening regardless of what the day has produced. A bad harvest does not cancel it. A difficult week does not postpone it. The social ritual operates as a daily cortisol reset that no individual discipline could sustain as reliably as a community expectation. The canonau wine is real. It contains procyanidin concentrations 3 to 5 times higher than French Bordeaux, and moderate consumption is well documented for its cardiovascular effects. But the researchers who studied the Sardinian centenarians consistently noted that the wine was consumed in a specific social context that separated it completely from solitary drinking. 1 glass. With people. After the day's work. Always. The parasympathetic nervous system shifts into dominance during relaxed social interaction. Heart rate slows. Cortisol drops. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that has been activated all day begins to downregulate. This happens automatically when the body perceives social safety. And the evening gathering provided that perception every day, without exception, for a lifetime. The Sardinian centenarians were not managing their cortisol. They were meeting their neighbors at the end of every day, because that is what their community did. Ritual 2. The Ikarian afternoon rest. On the Greek island of Ikaria, which has roughly half the dementia rate of the United States, the afternoon stops. After the midday meal, the village quiets. Shops close, work pauses. The body is allowed to shift into the parasympathetic state that digestion requires and that cortisol suppresses when it remains elevated. A 2007 study of 23,000 people, published in the Archives of Internal Medicine, found that regular afternoon nappers had a 37% lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease compared to non-nappers. The mechanism is the parasympathetic reset, the daily window in which the HPA axis downregulates, cortisol drops, and the cellular repair processes that sustained cortisol suppresses are allowed to operate. The depression rate on Ikaria is documented at 11.8%, among the lowest ever recorded in any Mediterranean population studied. The cognitive impairment rate in elderly Ikarians was similarly low in the research conducted by Legrand and colleagues. These outcomes likely reflect decades of consistent parasympathetic activation through the afternoon rest habit. Not occasional stress management, but a daily biological reset embedded in the cultural calendar. What makes the Ikarian pattern particularly significant is that it occurred twice daily. The afternoon rest combined with consistent nighttime sleep produced twice daily cortisol suppression that single-cycle sleep cannot replicate. The cardiovascular and cognitive outcomes in this population may partly reflect the cumulative difference between 1 cortisol reset per day and 2, sustained across an entire lifetime. Ritual 3. The Okinawan Moai. Before we continue, subscribe to Longevity Code. Every week we decode one longevity population, one system, one set of mechanisms, always peer-reviewed, always practical, always something you can start this week. In Okinawa, children are placed into social groups of approximately 5 people at a young age. These groups, moai, meet regularly, support each other through hardship, and in many cases remain together for life. Not as a formal institution, as a cultural expectation that the entire community reinforces. The psychological mechanism is specific. The knowledge that 5 people are structurally committed to your well-being, that they will notice if you are absent, appear at your door if you are ill, contribute if you face financial hardship, changes how the nervous system responds to daily uncertainty. The threat detection system that drives cortisol release is calibrated by perceived social support. When that support is structural rather than conditional, the baseline threat assessment shifts. The HPA axis operates in a different register. A meta-analysis of 148 studies covering over 300,000 participants found that adequate social relationships were associated with a 50% greater likelihood of survival. The researchers found that social isolation carried mortality risk equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The MOI addresses this variable structurally, not by encouraging people to be more social, but by building the social infrastructure into the community from childhood, so that isolation requires active effort rather than simply happening by default. The Okinawan centenarians were not managing their stress response. They were living inside a social structure that made sustained cortisol elevation from social isolation biologically improbable. Ritual 4. The Loma Linda Sabbath. From sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday, the Seventh-day Adventist community in Loma Linda stops completely. No work, no shopping, no competitive activity, church attendance, family meals, walks in nature, reading. 1 day out of every 7 in which the demands that produce chronic cortisol elevation are structurally removed. The Adventist Health Studies identified this practice as an independent longevity variable even after controlling for the dietary and behavioral factors that already distinguish this population. The Sabbath is both a practice and a social structure. It works not because individuals choose to rest, but because the entire community rests simultaneously. There is no social pressure to remain productive on Saturday in Loma Linda, because nobody around you is being productive either. This is the critical distinction between the Sabbath as a longevity variable and the concept of taking weekends off as a wellness recommendation. The Adventist women who live 6 years longer than California women are not experiencing the Sabbath as a chosen intervention. They are experiencing it as the unavoidable default that their community makes automatic. The weekly cortisol reset that the Sabbath provides may partly explain the cardiovascular data. The same population breathing the same polluted San Bernardino County air, living 10 years longer than their neighbors. Not because of individual willpower, but because of a community structure that made one day of complete cortisol suppression inevitable every 7 days for a lifetime. Ritual 5. The Nicoyan Plan de Vida. In Nicoya, Costa Rica, the only blue zone in the Western Hemisphere, the elderly do not retire in the Western sense. They do not stop working and wait to die. They shift. The agricultural work may slow. The daily physical demands may change. But the sense of purpose, the reason to get up in the morning, does not disappear at 65. The Nicoyan centenarians describe their plan de vida, their reason for being, as something as ordinary as tending a garden, caring for grandchildren, or providing the community with knowledge that only their years of experience can supply. It is not grand ambition. It is daily purpose, specific and social, and tied to the needs of real people who would notice its absence. The cortisol mechanism is specific. Purposelessness, the absence of a clear reason to engage with the day, activates the same threat detection pathways that social isolation does. The body interprets meaninglessness as a form of danger. When there is no reason to get up, the HPA axis cannot regulate normally. The chronic low-level cortisol elevation that accompanies purposelessness may be one of the least studied but most significant drivers of accelerated aging in retired populations. The 2008 psychosomatic medicine study of 43,391 Japanese adults found that those reporting ikigai, a sense of daily purpose, had significantly lower all-cause mortality over 7 years of follow-up. The Nicoyan Plan de Vida and the Okinawan Ikigai are culturally different expressions of the same biological mechanism. Purpose suppresses the chronic cortisol that purposelessness generates. The centenarians of Nicoya were not following a stress management protocol. They were living in a community that gave them something to do every morning that mattered to someone else. Now, the oxidative stress finding. When Makoto Suzuki's research team measured lipid peroxide levels, a direct marker of oxidative stress, in the blood of Okinawan centenarians, they found something that changed how they understood the relationship between lifestyle and cellular aging. The plasma lipid peroxide levels of the centenarian cohort were significantly lower than those of younger control subjects. Not slightly lower, significantly lower. This means the 100-year-olds showed less oxidative stress damage than people decades younger living in more conventional, modern environments. The cellular aging marker that chronic cortisol elevation drives through oxidative stress accumulation was running in reverse relative to what the researchers expected. The 5 rituals, the evening social gathering, the afternoon rest, the lifelong social group, the weekly complete rest, the daily sense of purpose, were collectively maintaining a cortisol environment so chronically suppressed that the oxidative stress cascade never fully initiated. Not through any single intervention, through a cultural framework that made chronic stress accumulation structurally improbable across an entire lifetime. The telomeres of these centenarians reflected a biological age that their chronological age made statistically improbable. The cells were aging more slowly because the hormone that drives cellular aging was chronically low. Not because of supplements or protocols, because of how their communities were structured. Which of these 5 rituals could you introduce into your daily or weekly life starting now? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to Longevity Code. Next week, another population, another system, another framework that produced outcomes the most sophisticated wellness industry in human history is still trying to replicate. Always the science, always something you can start this week.